I have chosen to kind of stay very high level because I know these talks can kind of have like people from like really different backgrounds when it comes to methane. And so I'm going to kind of give a little bit of background on waste methane, and then I'm going to dive into just some like science findings that Carbon Mapper has kind of seen so far. Staying very high level in all the different projects, so very open to like questions at the end about particular projects, or feel free to reach out afterward. And then also do a section at the very end about mitigation and just kind of stepping outside the science for a second and thinking about a lot of the work I do is working with a lot of stakeholders to kind of say, okay, we learned this thing about science or we have this really cool data product. How do we then translate that to methane mitigation? So again, like just going to stay really high level, but feel free if at the end if you have questions about particulars, I'm very happy to answer. Okay. For those of you who might be unaware, like who Carbon Mapper is or what they are, like I'm a research scientist and the waste lead at Carbon Mapper. We're a nonprofit that's really working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and really doing so through data and making accessible and transparent data available to stakeholders. Not going to talk through like a lot of details here, but just noting that we do work with remote sensing data and make it all publicly available on our data portal. A lot of what I do is both kind of on the science team working for how do we create a data product, how do we do science analyses with that data product, but then also with stakeholders and thinking about how do you use that data, what do we need that's not currently there, what kind of secondary data products do we need to help us do the work that we do. And so that's kind of some of the work that is done within Carbon Mapper. I work in the waste sector, though we have other folks who work more in the oil and gas sector, and kind of other folks who do more CO2, though I'm going to really focus on methane today. And so a little bit of background on kind of just for those who don't know methane from waste sector specifically. With waste sites, we can have I'm going to define these as two different types of emission sources. One is a area source. This is a kind of spread out emission from kind of a large area that's diffuse in nature. And so you might think of this as, for example, like at a closed landfill, you have methane that's coming through the landfill cover. And so this is really spread out. It's typically measurements are kind of flux-based measurements. Whereas then you have this, what Carbon Mapper would call a point source. And so this is a large emission from a localized area. In many cases, this is like a particular piece of infrastructure or, a particular activity or region of the site. And so on the right in the image, I'm just showing some examples of different types of point sources that we've seen from a landfill. So this can kind of range from equipment at the gas plant, if there's a gas plant. So landfills can have different means of they collect the gas and then they send it to, in some cases, a flare stack to destroy it, or in other cases, they use it to create energy. And so these kind of gas infrastructure, more similar to what we would see in the oil and gas sector, can have leaks from them, similar to what we would see in other sectors. But then also at the landfill, you can have emissions from the gas collection system itself. So you might have a well on the landfill that's down for a period of time due to maintenance. And so you might get emissions from kind of that area of the landfill. You also can have emissions coming from the cover. These sometimes are as area sources and sometimes as point sources. I would also say there's a gray area between those two. And so just kind of these emissions can manifest in different ways from the cover area. And then also we have something called the work face. So you'll hear me refer to this later on. This is where we're adding fresh waste into the landfill. And it's a very active, dynamic area of the landfill because there's trucks coming in, adding new waste. There's also often a lot of construction going on around the kind of edges of the work face. For those who might know a little bit less about landfills, so you have kind of this range of engineering that's applied. And so typically what we consider a landfill as opposed to a dump site, there is kind of engineering controls applied to that site. So things like they have a bottom liner to deal with kind of leachate from the site. You have cover on top. This is to try to reduce how much gas is going into the atmosphere. And so just knowing these are very complex engineered systems. And so that's why you kind of have this like complexity of emission sources that are possible just from one landfill site. Um, we also see emissions beyond just landfills. I'm really going to focus on solid waste for this talk. But even within kind of the solid waste sector, we see emissions from landfills. We can see these emissions from dump sites. So this is more where there's kind of none of these engineering controls, but there's still kind of waste being disposed in the area. We also sometimes see emissions from the biogas plants. So this is like if a landfill is collecting the gas and sending it to, for example, a facility to be upgraded into kind of pipeline quality gas, a renewable natural gas facility. Sometimes they have downtime, and so there might be an equipment leak at the facility or kind of a maintenance event. So that's just some background on kind of like the types of sources I'm really going to talk about today. Kind of at a high level, like why do we care about emissions for the waste sector? Well, these large emitters present a key mitigation opportunity. Both landfills and dump sites can emit these like really large volumes of methane, and they can be highly persistent sources. And there's also often co-pollutants being emitted with the methane. And so this means that it's both kind of beneficial to reduce emissions, both from a greenhouse gas mitigation standpoint, but also kind of the health co-benefits and community benefits that go along with that mitigation. And we know that there are technologies and solutions that exist to reduce these emissions. And so on the right, this is just kind of showing an image of kind of practices that can be implemented to try to reduce emissions from landfills. And so we need data to help inform mitigation decisions and track progress as we're implementing these new design changes or we're kind of making changes to upstream waste treatment. How do we verify that those changes are having the desired impact on emissions from the site? And so this is where data comes in. And there's a lot of amazing new technologies that exist. And with landfills, like because they're so complex in their emissions, it is really important to think about it from a kind of tiered monitoring perspective, that it's not just one technology that's going to solve all your problems. And so satellites present, one of these technologies and can, fill some of these uses, but they're not going to fill them all. But I'm really going to focus on kind of these remote sensing airborne and satellite instruments today for the sector. And so these instruments both detect and then quantify methane emissions from these large emitting point sources. Capabilities vary by instrument, and this includes capabilities like the spatial resolution, the spatiotemporal coverage. For example, with we at Carbon Mapper work both with airborne deployed instruments and satellite instruments. With an airborne instrument, you get really good fine resolution, spatial resolution, but you're also very limited in spatial temporal coverage. It's often a single campaign where we're going out for like a week-long period to do measurements in, a handful of sites. Whereas with the satellite, you kind of have coarser spatial resolution, but you also get kind of that ability to repeat observations as the satellite orbits in time, and you get that global coverage. And so just kind of noting that there's this trade-off between the capabilities, and so different instruments fill different needs. With these, so these are what we would call point source imaging satellites. As I said earlier, these really are designed to detect and quantify emissions from methane point sources. And so here I'm just kind of showing an example of as the satellite overpasses the ground surface, it's if there's a methane plume. So in this case, there's a landfill actually in this scene, and we've detected a plume from that landfill. So this plume is the methane enhancement above background that's coming from a particular source on the ground. And so this kind of zoomed in blue blobby image here is that methane plume that's coming from, in this case, it is a landfill that was observed by the Tanager satellite. And so when, we make an observation, we detect a plume, there's different kind of data products that go along with that observation. And so both for the airborne and satellite remote sensing instruments, we're going to have what we call a plume origin. So this is the latitude, longitude location on the ground where we're estimating that the emission is coming from. There's going to be a emission rate with that plume. And there's also going to be kind of visualization of that plume. So in this case, this kind of blue blobby image that I'm showing is for visualization purposes. It is not necessarily used in our kind of quantification of the emission rate. So it's just to note that there's a difference there between a visualization and what we use for quantification. And so then, as you collect more data in space and in time, especially with satellites, you can kind of create these secondary products like average emission rates for a source or look at trends over time. In kind of as we get spatial coverage, we can look at prevalence of large emitters, like how many large emitters is there in a given country or a given state. And we can aggregate emissions as well. Really going to stay at a high level here, but happy to kind of answer more questions about like the data workflow and details about our algorithms. But kind of at a high level, this is the kind of process that we go through. And so this is thinking about so the instruments are observing radiance. We're going to apply an algorithm to get to a methane retrieval. And so this is kind of methane concentration above background or methane enhancement. Then we go through a kind of quality control process to identify, okay, are there any methane plumes that we're seeing in this kind of observation? And then once we've kind of detected methane plumes, then we go through and do attribution. And so we're saying, okay, I think this is where the origin is. So that's that plume origin that I mentioned earlier. And then we can look and say, okay, well, what is the actual cause on the ground surface? Is it a landfill? Is it an oil and gas well pad? And so we attribute that plume to that source. When we apply an additional set of algorithms to go from this plume detection to an emission rate for that plume. In the bottom right here, I'm just showing a visualization of what one of those steps looks like, where we're kind of masking or segmenting the plume. And so you're kind of saying, I think these pixels are part of my methane plume, and I'm going to use those to determine my mass of methane and then my emission rate. And then we have an additional quality control process before publishing these plumes. I know that was a lot, but yeah, happy to answer questions at the end more on this. So noting that in this workflow, we have multiple algorithms that go into this here. We do a lot of validation, and so a lot of the kind of choice of algorithm and then the parameterizations are based on this validation here. I'm not going to go into details on this, but just noting that there are kind of these different ways that we think about validation. This is like through controlled release experiments, as I know folks have presented in these webinars before in that. These are also through like intercomparisons across instruments or comparisons against like LES modeling. And so just noting that there's kind of these different ways that we help fine tune the algorithms. Also noting that for the waste sector, there's often a more limited set of validation. And so it just something to note that a lot of like the existing mechanisms for validation are really geared towards more oil and gas sector type plumes. And so we need to be careful about when we think about algorithms applying to the waste sector and how we can more explicitly account for unique characterizations, like there's topography at landfills. There's often really heterogeneous albedo and things like this that we need to account for when thinking about validation. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some of our kind of science results. So kind of at a high level, like one thing that we're seeing, especially now that we have satellite data, is that we do see these large emissions, so these large point source emissions globally from both landfills and dump sites. And so here, this is just showing a screenshot of our data, and there's other kind of data elsewhere that exists from other instruments that's seeing a very similar pattern as well, that we really see these across the globe. And so it's not just like one country has these landfills that have high emissions. Just kind of to put this in context, noting that if you kind of look at For these large emission sources that we've detected in the waste sector, these are accounting for about 10% of global waste methane. So this is not just solid waste methane, this is kind of total waste methane. And so that's, pretty significant mitigation opportunity for these kind of just these large emission sources. And when we compare to our observations of other sectors, we're seeing that, for Carbon Mapper's observations of point sources globally, the waste sector accounts for about a tenth of the number of sources we've detected, but it's a quarter of emissions. So these are really like large emission sources, and because of their persistence, they really have this outsized impact on emissions and mitigation potential. And so there's kind of some key takeaways that we found from our science studies so far. And I'm going to kind of walk through each one at a high level individually. And so the first one is that landfill point source emissions are prevalent and highly persistent. And so this kind of originally started by doing airborne campaigns in the US, where we were seeing that when we're observing a lot of these large landfills in the US, we're seeing about half of the landfills have these large point source emissions. And I think initially that was a bit surprising, just that, we knew landfills emitted methane, but the fact that they had emissions that were acting like point sources was a bit surprising. And now we've kind of, through repeat surveys, both in the US and then also now looking globally, see that this isn't just a US thing, that we really see these point sources at sites around the world. And then on the right here, I'm just showing this was just some evidence to fit to that statement I made earlier about that we see that landfill emissions are highly persistent. We see both with early airborne studies in the US and then also with the satellite instrument now that as we do repeat observations at individual sites, we see that often if they have an emission the first time we see them, if we come back months or years later, they often still have emissions. And so it's just this idea that compared to other sectors that we may think about, typically for point sources and for methane, these are highly persistent sources. So the other major takeaway is that we see that the landfill work phase is what I mentioned earlier, where new waste is added, is a significant source of methane emissions. We really first dug into this in a study using airborne observations in 2023, where we were looking at about 17% of open landfills in the US. And of those, we took any plumes that we detected and attributed them to different, parts of the landfill. And we found that the work face and kind of the periphery around the work face was kind of where those landfills that had emissions from this area really were the larger emitters in all regions surveyed in that study. So that's what this map here is kind of showing, that for those landfills that had plumes, the kind of orange ones are the ones that had work face emissions, and they tend to be the largest emitters. And just kind of showing that same result, but now kind of aggregated to all the sites observed. We found that, these work face emissions, we were able to attribute emissions to the work face at about 7% of the emitting landfills that we observed, but they accounted for 79% of emissions. So they're really this idea that these emissions from landfills that have emissions from this work face area are large emitters within the regions where we identify them. And so then the third takeaway is that we see that operational events can significantly contribute to emissions variability. Here, I'm just going to demonstrate that by showing these are just two examples of kind of individual cases where we see this to be the case. And one of the reasons why I'm kind of showing this through the individual examples is it's kind of a hard thing to study because you really need to coordinate and kind of understand what's going on at the site from an operator's perspective. And so there's a lot of coordination that needs to be done, and communication with operators is key for understanding this. But in both of these examples, you can see in the black and white images on the bottom are showing observations on 2 different days, where you see this huge contrast in terms of the white is showing the methane enhancement or the methane plumes. And you really see this kind of huge contrast in different time periods of observation of what the methane from the site looks like. So in both cases, the emissions are persistent, but they're just changing in time. And in both cases, it's kind of related to operational changes that are being made on the site. On the left, it was a case where they had temporary downtime in their gas collection system because they had some fluid buildup. And so when that gas collection system went down, you saw this huge uptick in emissions. On the right case, it was kind of this situation where we had certain sources that were like pressurized sources from kind of where the gas collection was occurring that were appearing at one period of time. And then 2 days later, we observed the same site and those sources were gone and the emissions drastically decreased when those sources went away. And so we're really seeing that these kind of short-term events can have significant impact on day-to-day emissions variability. Okay, so then another one, another major takeaway is that we see that these observations do not agree with models. And this is both, initially we were looking at this in the US. And so landfills in the US, a lot of large ones have to report or had to report to the US GHGRP. So this is just reporting, they're modeling their emissions and then reporting that value. And we see that, when we compare our observations to that what they're reporting, there's a subset of landfills where we see much higher emissions than what they're reporting. When we look globally with a satellite, we see similar case in that the observations tend to not just like they don't agree with the models, though it's more varied, where in some cases we see overestimation, in some cases we see underestimation. And I'm just showing some images of an example in Chile where we have observations kind of across a lot of the large landfills in Chile, and we see that when we sum up our emissions in the country, we get really close to the national inventory, where existing global inventories that aren't the national inventory tend to disagree. And so I think then that this kind of brings along the question of like, well, why is there this disagreement? And so we've done a study where we really dug into this for the United States, looking at landfills there, just noting that there's kind of these two methods to estimate emissions for the US GHGRP. This is what we would call a generation first and then a recovery first method. I'm not going to talk in detail about this here, but just noting that in general, what we find is that the activity data that's used in both of these models, so this is in one case the amount of waste per site, and in the other case, it's the kind of measured collected gas. These underlying metrics really actually do correlate well with observations. But then when we translate, we go from the activity data to the emission estimated by the model, we lose some of that agreement. And so there's some sort of assumption that's being made in the models that kind of contributes to this disagreement. And so we dug into this for some model reconciliation work in the US in detail. This was work done by my coworker at the time, Kate Howell. And so she was really looking into, we had these airborne studies in California and the US, or California and the Southeast, and looking into, we see this really good correlation with gas collection. So this is like measured gas collected by the landfill that's being reported by the operator. But then when they go and use this this is the blue method here, so it's the recovery first method, to estimate emissions, we see that there's this bias introduced where our observations are high compared to what they're reporting, or they're reporting the modeled emissions have a low bias. And so we were like, well, let's use the observational data to correct this bias. And one of the reasons we focused on this particular model was because we saw good correlation with the modeled emissions, but we just saw a bias, and the bias varied by region. And so our interest was, okay, for this collection first type model, they assume a landfill collection efficiency that, it's just an assumed factor. And so there's uncertainty in it. And so we're saying, well, if we use that as a kind of, let's assume that the bias is being introduced by that process of assuming a collection efficiency, and use the observational data to correct that collection efficiency. And so by doing those, and again, not going to go into detail here, but we, for California and for the Southeast, we kind of apply this correction, and we come up with a observation-informed regional collection efficiency. And in general, what we find is that in California, we find that our kind of observation-informed collection efficiency is lower for the landfills that we observed in that study, but it's not too far outside what's being reported. Whereas when we move to the southeast, we find that our kind of observation-informed collection efficiency is actually much lower than what's being reported, indicating that that model bias could potentially be because they're kind of making the wrong assumption about their collection efficiencies, especially in the Southeast. Noting that we did this both in California with the airborne observations and then also with the Tanager satellite observations, finding very similar results across instruments. And so I'm gonna like kind of skip through this pretty quickly so we have time for questions, but just want to note that this science work that I went through here is just one part of what we do. And so a lot of it then is like, okay, we did all this cool science, but like, what does that mean for stakeholders and how do stakeholders use this to make decisions about mitigation? And so I think that there are many ways that this can kind of translate down to stakeholders. For the waste sector, specifically, both the data and like the insights we glean from the data help support both direct mitigation and indirect mitigation. And so what I mean by that is like direct mitigation would be like we see a methane leak and we're going to send that information, including the location of where we're estimating the sources, to the operator. And then they're going to go out and use that information directly to do investigation on the site and potentially fix that leak. And we can also use the observational data to verify that that change was successful. And that's what's being shown here for a landfill in California on the top right images. For waste, there's also many cases where we do this indirectly. And so this is where we're taking the data and we're deriving some insight from the data, and then we're doing engagement around that insight to help move changes forward in the sector. And so this might be through like identifying large emission sources or like the underlying causes, and so helping push forward changes and best practices at site. And so this is the work-face emission study that we did is one example of this, of really saying like, look, we're seeing these large emissions from this activity on the landfill. And so we need to think about how we change best practices in this part of the landfill in particular in order to kind of move forward methane mitigation. And this kind of translates to policy as well, especially for something like the landfill work-face, where kind of the way that a lot of landfill rules are right now in many states is that you don't really have to capture gas from the kind of area of young waste at the landfill. And so this means that, there's a handful of years where new waste is being added and there's no gas capture. And so it's not necessarily surprising then that we're seeing, some degree of emissions from this area of the landfill. And so there are kind of, by using the science that we did and kind of saying like, look, this is an important source and we need to think about it more thoroughly in our regulations, we can advocate for kind of more practices that address these emissions, like, for example, installing earlier gas capture for these kind of young waste areas of the landfill. Another way that we can kind of indirectly move mitigation forward is thinking about MRV frameworks and how stakeholders might be more motivated to change activities at a site and do mitigation if they can essentially get credit for that mitigation. And so we need really transparent and accurate methodologies for kind of looking at emissions changes over time in response to these mitigation actions. And so here's just like kind of some ideas if you're not familiar with like working with stakeholders before. There's different ways that they may be interested in this type of data. Sometimes it is, like I said earlier, like a science study, and they want to kind of know like, oh, what did you find in this study, and how can I, bring that into my day-to-day work as a stakeholder. In other cases, they actually want like a data product, and often this isn't like the actual data product we use for science might not translate well to their use case. And so just noting that depending on what type of stakeholder you work with, like we often work with jurisdictions. So this might be like a country or city. They might be interested in knowing, okay, I want to know, of the landfills in my city. So this is just showing an example zoomed in for Mexico City here in the center top image. Which are the large emitters? And I'm going to use that information to help prioritize sites for mitigation and engagement. In some cases, too, we have stakeholders who are like, well, I want to know, I want to improve my national emissions model. And so how do I use your data to do so? And so that translates a lot to the work that we're doing in model improvement and model reconciliation. And so then there's other cases where we work with a facility directly. And so this might be like an operator or a local government. And so thinking about what's their interest in the facility. A lot of times, like they only care about one landfill or a couple landfills rather than kind of this vast, all the landfills in a country, for example. And so their interest and their data needs are often very different. And so one example of what they might want to do is actually do follow-up on the site and say, okay, tell me where you're detecting persistent emissions from on my landfill, and I'm going to go and use a handheld device and try to find that leak and fix it. And so for kind of these different uses, you have to think about, okay, what is the important piece of the data that they need, and what kind of format of the data product do they need? And just noting that one kind of example where we do this is through the low methane initiative. And so we participate through the data team. And so this is, we actually help develop a kind of data strategy for thinking about, okay, how do we, through low methane, we work with subnational jurisdictions. So this is like cities, for example. And within the kind of program, they are both kind of looking at estimating their emissions for their city and then also making mitigation plans. And so we kind of came up with a data strategy for how to use satellite data and modeling data to estimate baseline emissions for the landfills within their jurisdiction. And so here, I think this is just, again, to reiterate this point that for these different uses of data for these different stakeholders, different parts of the data are really important. And so if I'm trying to find leaks on my site, the geolocation accuracy of the kind of origin is really important. Whereas if I'm a state government and I really want to just know which facilities in my state are large emitters, and maybe I want to go and do some inspections at those facilities. And so I care more about getting spatial coverage of observations, and I really want, a observing system that can observe all the landfills across my state. And so as one of my jobs at Carbon Mapper is thinking about, okay, let's see what the stakeholders are interested in, and let's map that back to how we collect the data that kind of supports those needs, or how do we kind of do the science research that supports their needs. And I'm going to skip this so we can get to questions. So I will just end here with this slide of just noting that, data is just one piece of the puzzle. And so, if anyone's interested in working with us, please let us know, both from a science perspective or kind of more on the stakeholder side. And we do have public data. So if you want to check it out, please do.